Hey guys, welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Now, if you're as old as I am, you might remember the good old days of overclocking. I'm talking about the days when you could purchase a relatively inexpensive processor and overclock it to achieve flagship levels of performance. Take the Celeron 300A for example. Now this is a processor I have very fond memories of. I used this in the first computer I ever built back in my high school days, and the reason I used this processor was because it could be overclocked. With a few minor adjustments in the BIOS, it could run as fast as the much more expensive Pentium 450MHz processor. Well, roughly 20 years after releasing the first ever Pentium processor, Intel decided to create the Pentium Anniversary Edition shipped back in mid-2014, which we now know as the G3258. This was an unlocked budget processor, and it was the first time we'd seen a sub-$200 processor from Intel that could be overclocked in quite some time. In a way, the G3258 was a small nod back to the days when Intel overclocking was fun and wasn't exploited for profit. As good as an unlocked Haswell dual-core was back in 2014 for just $72 US, it was after all still just a dual-core with support for only 2 threads. At the time, we dreamt of a similar Core i3 chip and was eventually rewarded with the 7350K almost 3 years later. Actually, rewarded is probably the wrong word to use, but anyway. Intel's 7th generation Core i3 range looks pretty lackluster even with an unlocked Core i3 at the head of the family. The same thankfully can't be said for the new hyper-threading enabled Pentium lineup. These new Kaby late processors look really good, while at least the $64 G4560 does anyway. Out of the box, the G4560 comes clocked at a respectable 3.5GHz. Of course, while this is 300MHz higher than the G3258 Anniversary Edition, this older unlocked Pentium processor can easily hit frequencies such as the 4.6GHz that I tested at. That hands the older Pentium processor more than a 30% clock speed advantage, so can hyper-threading really make up the difference? This is the question a lot of G3258 owners have been asking me over the past few weeks, so I decided to find out. I'm not going to bother testing the G3258 at its stock out of the box frequency. I can't imagine anyone who bought this chip, knowing that it is unlocked, would do so. Also, I won't be using the GTX 1080 or Titan XP for testing. Rather, the more modest RX 470 will be used. This should give us a good idea of how these CPUs compare under realistic conditions. So with that, let's get to the results. First up we have Battlefield 1, and not a lot needs to be said here. The G4560 does a great job with the RX 470, while the G3258 performed horribly. Even though you do see a 37 FPS average, with frame rates constantly dipping below 20 FPS, the game was a stuttery mess. Much the same was seen at 1440p, and although the RX 470 does limit performance on the higher end CPUs, the G3258 is still in no way comparable. Given what was just seen when testing with Battlefield 1, I was shocked to see such strong performance from the overclocked G3258 in the CPU-intensive Civilization 6. Apparently 2 cores will work just fine here, as long as they are clocked high enough. Similar margins were seen at 1440p, and again the overclocked Anniversary Edition chip pulled ahead of the G4560, and I have to say gameplay was very smooth. The performance when playing Deus Ex Mankind Divided was very similar to that of Battlefield 1, though not quite as bad. Still, with an average of 50 FPS, those dips down below 30 FPS were very noticeable when they occurred. At 1440p, we see a 5 FPS difference between the minimum and average frame rates on the processors with 4 threads or more. The G3258, on the other hand, had an 11 FPS variation, and again this was noticeable due to the stuttering effect that it created. Even F1 2016 saw the frame rate drop as low as 30 FPS with the G3258, and this limited the average frame rate to just 49 FPS. This meant that the G4560 was over 30% faster and able to maintain much more consistent performance. Once again, we find that even at 1440p, the Anniversary Edition chip is severely lacking in terms of performance when paired with the RX 470. Gears of War 4 might be a DirectX 12 title, but it didn't help out Intel's dual-core budget processor from 2014. Again, the G3258 is considerably slower than the G4560, despite a massive clock speed advantage. The 1440p results didn't look too bad, but again with a larger frame rate variation between the minimum and averages, the G3258 didn't provide the same smooth experience. Performance for the G3258 in Grand Theft Auto 5 was very similar to what was experienced in Battlefield 1. In other words, it was pretty much unplayable and a complete stutterfest. Moving to 1440p, things got even worse, and despite the 54 FPS average, for the most part I was watching a slideshow. The original South Park series offered smoother animation. Although frame rates were down in Hitman, the G3258 didn't play that poorly. In fact, the game was very playable. That said, with the RX 470 taking care of rendering, performance was considerably better with the G4560. The margins close up at 1440p, and here the G3258 isn't terribly different to the higher end CPUs thanks to the GPU bottleneck. Mafia III plays like rubbish on most high-end systems, so unsurprisingly it's not a fan of the dual-core Anniversary Edition processor. Like Battlefield 1 and Deus Ex Mankind Divided, we find unplayable performance even at 1080p. Things don't improve at 1440p, and that 11 FPS minimum really says it all. I actually expected Mirror's Edge Catalyst to play quite well on the dual-core. Performance was extremely choppy, just as I'd experienced previously in a few modern titles such as Battlefield 1. There obviously wasn't much point going on and testing 1440p, but I did so anyway. Just quickly, here are the results. Not much else needs to be said really, so let's move on. Again, I was a bit surprised to find that even our Overwatch bot test hammered the G3258 so hard, despite its 4.6GHz clock speed. That said, the bot test is a very CPU intensive test, so the results shouldn't be entirely surprising. Moving to 1440p, we still see a massive difference between the average and minimum frame rates when using the G3258. Quantum Break was playable using the G3258, but as you can see, this processor loses serious ground to the G4560. Even at 1440p, the average frame rate using the RX 470 is well down with the dual-core processor. Rise of the Tomb Raider ran horribly using either Intel Pentium processor when paired with the RX 470. Despite the positive looking average frame rate, the minimum led to stuttering issues. This is of course also seen at 1440p, and this is one of the few games where I previously found the G4560 to perform much better with the GTX 1050 Ti than it did the RX 470. Finally, we have Total War Warhammer, and here we see despite being slower, the G3258 did deliver playable performance. Still, this title really calls for a quad-core or at least a hyper-threading enabled dual-core with a hefty operating frequency. The numbers do even up at 1440p as the game becomes more GPU bound, thanks to the use of the RX 470. Well, at this point, I'm not even sure you need me to summarise the results or give you my opinion, but as always, you're going to get it anyway. The Pentium G3258 didn't cut the mustard in 2016, and it's certainly not going to in 2017. For modern gaming, the dual-core is well and truly dead. If you're playing games such as Rocket League, then something like the G3258 will work fine, but for games like Battlefield 1, not so much. Importantly, I should also note that games such as Far Cry Primal, Tom Clancy's The Division, Titanfall 2, Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, and Doom were all removed from testing as none of these games played nicely with the dual core. They either failed to load, crashed in game, or performed so poorly I wasn't able to run my tests. Meanwhile, games such as Battlefield 1, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, Grand Theft Auto 5, Mafia III, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, and Rise of the Tomb Raider were all unplayable using the G3258. Although I didn't look at power consumption for this comparison, I can assure you that an overclocked G3258 consumes considerably more power than the G4560, so that's another nail in the Anniversary Edition processor's coffin then. Overclocking the Pentium G3258 Anniversary Edition chip was fun while it lasted, but I think it's now time to move on. The G4560 is the new kid on the block, and I have been hyping the hell out of this thing for the last few weeks. At $64 US or $78 Aussie, there's no denying it's a seriously good buy. And with the ability to upgrade to a more capable Core i5 processor, or perhaps even a Core i7 down the track, makes it a safe investment. I just wonder though that if in a month's time we'll still be singing the praise of the G4560. Things move pretty quickly, and with what's happening next month, it may not be the case, but we'll just have to wait and see. On that note, it's time for me to get out of here and back to some more benchmarking. I'm your host Steve, I'll see you again soon.